They say the dead never leave, but when you're alone in the dead of night, the question isn't just whether they're watching, but what they might want from you. Welcome to the story of a night shift that became a descent into the unknown. I recently got a job at a historic hotel downtown. The building is over 150 years old, a charming but eerie relic of another time. From the moment I walked in, it felt like stepping into another world. Torn wallpaper revealed psychedelic patterns from decades past. The hallways were narrow and dimly lit, and the upper floors painted in garish orange and yellow seemed to pulse with history. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to spend your nights unless, of course, you had no choice. The hiring process was shockingly fast. Within 24 hours of applying, I found myself behind the front desk, nervously smiling at my manager, a young man only a few years older than me. The owner, a stereotypical wealthy businessman, seemed far less concerned about the hotel's upkeep than its profitability. Mice scurried through the basement, ceiling tiles threatened to collapse, and plumbing issues plagued the rooms. And yet, it wasn't the structural decay that unnerved me most. No, that honor went to the stories. The hotel, as it turns out, has a reputation. Guests and employees alike whispered about the two spirits said to haunt its halls. Lady Churchill, a tragic figure from the hotel's early days, was rumored to linger in room 49, where she had met her untimely end. Guests claimed to smell her perfume or catch glimpses of her face in mirrors. Some even reported her spirit flying at them in rage when they dared open the door. My boss casually pointed out her room during my first tour, like it was an amusing sideshow attraction. Then there was Brady, a man who'd been stabbed on the basement stairwell long ago. His ghost was said to roam the unused, pitch-dark stairway, which now served as a storage area for discarded furniture. The light there never worked, casting shadows that seemed to shift when no one was watching. My shift ran from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. each night. Every evening began with a solitary sweep of the hotel 4 floors of guest rooms, the back stairwell, the eerie basement, and the forgotten passageways behind the elevator. Alone in the silent, dimly lit halls, my flashlight beam often felt like the only thing tethering me to reality. One night, as I walked the fire escape stairs, my footsteps echoed too loudly, making the air feel heavier with each step. The basement, my least favorite area, was a labyrinth of shadows and strange noises. Beer kegs and old furniture loomed like sentinels, and Brady's stairwell always seemed darker than the rest of the space, even with the faint glow of my flashlight. During my second week, my boss switched me to the evening shift for cross-training. That's when I met Peggy, a longtime employee with a knack for storytelling. She told me about past incidents. A fired employee who had harassed his co-workers, a drug addict caught rummaging through the back office, and a police standoff on the roof when jewel thieves used the hotel as their hideout. Her stories were unnerving, but one detail stood out. She mentioned finding a man halfway through a gap in the boiler room's wall. He'd claimed he was just curious about what lay beyond. On one particular night, I heard an alarm blaring from the basement. By the time I reached the source, the noise had stopped, but the hairs on the back of my neck wouldn't settle. I checked every corner, my flashlight catching dust motes and cobwebs, but found nothing. Later, during my rounds, I passed by room 49. The door was slightly ajar, though I knew no one had checked in there. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but a faint floral scent lingered in the air. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. A shadow moved across the mirror, though when I turned, no one was there. I quickly left, locking the door behind me. By the end of the week, I felt like the hotel was testing me, daring me to uncover its secrets. Each step down those halls felt like walking a tightrope between reality and the unknown. Every creak, every shadow whispered a question: do you really want to know the truth? But the scariest part wasn't the ghosts. It was the realization that the guests, the employees, and perhaps even myself might be the ones feeding the hotel's restless spirits. After all, in a place this old, who's to say where the past ends and the present begins? Imagine working alone in a quiet, eerie care home, only to be haunted by strange noises, unexplained movements, and whispers about a mysterious little girl. What happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the supernatural. In 2013, I started working as a support worker at a care home for teenagers and young adults aged 18 to 30. Most of the residents had autism, brain damage, or challenging behavior. The house itself was massive, with 2 living rooms, a big kitchen, a games room, a study, and 5 bedrooms. Outside, there was a large garden with a summer house, an activity room, and acres of fields and woodland. I'd been working there for about 3 weeks, primarily on the waking night shift. My hours ran from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., and it was my job to make sure the residents were settled and the house was clean before the day staff arrived. Usually, I'd finish my tasks around 1 a.m. and spend the rest of the night keeping an ear out for anyone who woke up. Most nights were uneventful, and the residents typically slept through. One night, a young man named James, his real name has been changed, was particularly restless. James wasn't very big, but he had incredible strength, especially when he was in a bad mood. He could lose his temper over the smallest things. Once he threw a staff member through a patio door because she forgot to add cold water to his tea. James couldn't speak in full sentences, but he communicated with simple phrases like, "James, make breakfast," when he wanted food, or "James, go outside," when he wanted to play. He was generally well-behaved and even funny at times, but everyone knew how dangerous he could be when frustrated. Around 11 p.m., James came downstairs to make a drink. I stood in the doorway, keeping an eye on him to ensure he didn't hurt himself or break anything. Once he was done, he went back upstairs without causing any trouble. I sat at the bottom of the stairs, watching his door for about 15 minutes to ensure he didn't disturb the other residents. When everything seemed calm, I returned to my cleaning. The room directly below James' bedroom was a communal living room with a TV, board games, books, and sofas. I was in there dusting and mopping the floor when I heard something heavy hit the floor above me. Thinking James might be having a tantrum, I went upstairs to check. I knocked on his door, but before I could open it with the key, he opened it himself. James looked calm, almost half asleep, with his eyes barely open. I asked if he was okay, and he nodded, giving me a thumbs up, a sign he used when he was in a good mood. I told him to be careful and went back downstairs, assuming he'd just knocked something over. About an hour later, I was cleaning the kitchen when I heard another loud bang above me. This time I realized the room above the kitchen was the spare room, which was empty. Confused, I went upstairs to check. The room was empty, and as far as I could tell, everyone was asleep. Each resident's door had an alarm that would alert staff if it was opened. The alarms were activated at night, and I carried a receiver that would light up and beep to indicate which door had been opened. The receiver hadn't gone off, so I knew the noise didn't come from any of the residents. The rest of the night passed without incident. The next night, as I arrived for my shift, I immediately sensed something was off. James was at the bottom of the stairs, covering his ears and humming loudly. 3 staff members were trying to calm him down. After a few minutes, they escorted him to the sitting room. The house manager explained that James had been agitated for hours, repeatedly saying, "Sarah, the little girl." This was unusual for James. The staff assumed he must have seen something on TV or in a movie that stuck in his head. Once James was settled, the other staff left, and I got on with my tasks. Around 1 a.m., I went upstairs to check on the residents. As I reached the first floor landing, I noticed the light near James' room was off. His room was on the left side of the staircase, and the light switch was just outside his door. When I turned the corner, I saw James standing silently in the dark. He was completely naked, his eyes wide open. At that moment, I felt a wave of unease. I spoke to him calmly, asking what he was doing, but he said nothing. When I turned the light back on, he let out a piercing scream and started hitting himself. The sleeping staff woke up, and together we managed to calm James and get him back into bed. I had 4 days off after that shift and was relieved to leave. When I returned, I learned that James had become more obsessed with the little girl he spent hours staring out the window overlooking the garden, whispering, "Little girl, where are you?" Then, one night around 3 a.m., the alarm went off for the spare room, the same one that had been empty during the loud noises earlier. That door was always locked, so I couldn't understand how it had been opened. I went upstairs to check and found James standing in the room in complete darkness, whispering, "Where are you?" I gently touched his shoulder and guided him back to his room, but as I locked the spare room door, he screamed, "Oh no," and began pounding on the door with his fists. At the same time, the alarm for the front door went off. Only the house manager and I had keys to the front door, and the manager never arrived before 8 a.m. when I went to check. I found the door wide open. The following night, another resident, Connor, said someone had been tapping on his window. His window was on the 3rd floor, 25 feet off the ground. When I checked, the security lock was still sealed, so no one could have opened it. Later, as I stood outside Connor's room, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Connor froze and whispered, "Is he back?" I asked, "Who?" but he didn't respond. Instead, he sank into his bed, pulling the duvet up to his mouth. That night, strange events kept piling up, and I'll never forget what I found in the spare room the next morning. Imagine starting a new security job, only to find yourself patrolling a building where doors unlock themselves, ghostly piano music echoes down dark hallways, and shadowy figures seem to toy with you. What I experienced during my night shifts might just be the most chilling thing you'll ever hear. About a month ago, I started working as a night security guard at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was immediately assigned the night shift. My schedule typically runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekends. The campus doesn't have dormitories, so I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and incredibly quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and after a while, patrolling the empty, dark hallways becomes equally boring. The college itself has an interesting history. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls in the late 1800s. Originally, it was run by nuns and catered to young women training to become nuns themselves. The academy closed in the late 1960s, and after almost a decade of disrepair, the state converted it into a community college. The building sits on a hill overlooking a highway, and its mix of old convent wings and newer additions gives it an eerie vibe. I'm not someone who believes in the supernatural. I try to focus on my job and mind my own business. But during my time here, strange things have been happening that I just can't explain. The security cameras are standard CCTV with no audio, but I've been hearing crackling static noises from the monitor. There's no option to enable or disable audio on the system, so this shouldn't even be possible. The static comes and goes randomly. I've also heard the sound of footsteps like leather soles clopping down the hallways through the monitor. But when I check the cameras, there's no one there. In the convent wing, the lockers are supposed to remain locked and untouched. Sometimes I find them wide open. I've even seen them swing open on the cameras. My supervisor is the only one who can review playback footage, so I can't confirm what's causing it. Doors that I know I've locked during my rounds are often found wide open by the time I do my next patrol. The motion sensors are equally baffling. They sometimes detect movement on floors I'm not on, lighting up empty hallways. Other times they won't react even when I'm walking right under them. The strangest incidents happen near the library, which used to be the Academy's chapel. I've heard piano music echoing down the hallways near this area. The melody is always the same, the prelude to Carpenter's Te Deum. I remember it from piano lessons I took as a kid. At first I thought I was imagining these things, but the experiences keep piling up. I don't drink, I don't use drugs, and I have no history of mental illness. These occurrences aren't one-time events, they happen regularly. I haven't told my supervisor about the piano music or the footsteps yet. How do you explain something like this without sounding insane? I don't want to come across as a coward or jeopardize my job, but every time I patrol those dark halls, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. The cameras pick up strange things, the motion sensors seem to have a mind of their own, and that haunting piano music keeps playing, even though there's no one there. Something is happening here, and I can't explain it. What would you do if a late-night customer wasn't there for your product but for you? This chilling story about a barista's encounter with a man who grew increasingly obsessed will keep you hooked until the very last sentence. This happened about 2 years ago, on my 28th birthday. I was working at a small, double-sided, drive-through coffee stand about 30 minutes outside of Seattle. At that point, I'd been a barista for about 7 years and had never experienced anything like what happened that day. I hope I never do again. It was a Thursday, around 6:45 p.m. I was preparing to close the stand at 7, as usual. It was rare for customers to come through past 6:30, so I was surprised when I looked up from cleaning the espresso machine and saw a man waiting at the open walk-up window. For safety reasons, we usually don't serve walk-up customers after dark, but since the window on that side of the stand was already open, I had no choice but to acknowledge him. Reluctantly, I decided to take his order. The man introduced himself as Ivan. He looked about my age and was clean and well kept. His English was good, though he had a slight accent. Despite his normal appearance, there was something off about him. His eyes made me uneasy. There was a darkness there that I couldn't ignore. My intuition was screaming at me that something wasn't right. I greeted him as politely as I could, even though I was uncomfortable. While preparing to make his drink, I noticed he didn't seem to know what he wanted. I asked twice what he'd like to order, but he kept avoiding the question. Eventually, it became clear he wasn't there for coffee. Instead, he started making small talk. He asked me where I was from, how long I'd been working at the stand, and other personal questions. I answered briefly, trying to make it clear that I wasn't interested in chatting. After a long pause, he asked, "So, do you have a boyfriend?" Annoyed, I replied curtly. No, I was done with the conversation and told him I needed to finish closing up so I could go home. As he walked away, he said, "I'm looking forward to seeing you again very soon." A minute or so later, he was out of sight, but I still felt uneasy. It was like I could feel his presence nearby, watching me. I quickly locked the doors, closed the stand, and drove home. By the next day, I had mostly forgotten about the encounter. I went to work as usual and finished my shift without any issues. But at 7 p.m., just as I was about to close the stand, I noticed movement outside the opposite window. It was Ivan. My stomach dropped, and the air inside the stand suddenly felt freezing cold. He smiled at me with a predatory grin and waved before pulling the closed window open himself. The way he did it was unnerving. It wasn't aggressive, but it was intimidating. I tried to stay calm and told him I was off the clock. I explained that the machine was cleaned and the register was closed for the day, so I couldn't make him anything. His smile widened as he said, "It's okay. I didn't come for the coffee. I came for you." At this, my fear turned into irritation. "I don't care what you came for." I said firmly, "I'm closed." He chuckled, raised his hands in mock surrender, and said, "Fair enough. Then I'll see you tomorrow." I locked the window as soon as he left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. When I got home, I barely slept. The next morning, I was scheduled to open the stand at 5 a.m. By 8:30, the sun was finally up, and I was feeling a bit more at ease. That's when I noticed a familiar truck pulling into the lot. It was my ex-boyfriend, Jonathan. We weren't on good terms, but he explained that he wanted to stop by and wish me a happy birthday. As he spoke, I noticed someone approaching the stand on foot. It was Ivan. Suddenly, I was grateful for Jonathan's presence. I whispered to him, asking him to stay at the stand until Ivan left. He could see the fear in my eyes and agreed. When Ivan reached the window, I walked over cautiously. He looked like he'd been crying. His eyes were red, and there were streaks of tears on his cheeks. "I don't need this anymore," he said abruptly, throwing what I later realized was his Russian passport through the window. Puzzled, I asked why he wouldn't need it, but he just said, "I won't." Before I could respond, he walked around to the back of the stand. I followed his movements and watched as he circled the building 3 times before stopping at the window again. This time he wasn't crying. His expression had changed completely. "God came to me in my dreams," he began. "He told me, 'You are my wife. You are my wife, and you will come with me now.'" He climbed onto the small ledge beneath the window, trying to pull himself into the stand. I slammed the window shut and locked it. He even stepped down, stared at me, and smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. I called 911, frantically explaining the situation to the operator while keeping an eye on Ivan. He moved to the back door of the stand and started punching numbers into the keypad lock. My heart stopped when I heard the beep indicating he'd guessed the correct code. The door unlocked with a loud thunk, and Ivan stepped inside, holding a knife. I screamed for Jonathan, who rushed to the back door just as Ivan took 2 steps toward me. Jonathan grabbed him from behind, putting him in a headlock and pulling him to the ground. Jonathan held him there until the police arrived. Ivan was arrested, but he kept insisting that I was his wife, claiming God had promised me to him. To this day, I can't fully process what happened. I'm just grateful Jonathan was there to protect me. I don't know what Ivan's intentions were, but I hope I never see him again. Imagine patrolling a massive abandoned office building at night when strange noises, moving objects, and chilling screams start to haunt your every step. What begins as an ordinary shift turns into a nightmarish encounter that will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows. Stay tuned, this story will chill you to the bone. I've been working as a nighttime security guard for as long as I can remember. My job involves watching over older, abandoned places. Usually it's nothing too crazy. Sometimes I'll have to run off a homeless person or two, but that's about it. That was until the summer of 2014. I live in Texas, and around here we don't put up with nonsense. There's a reason they say, "Don't mess with Texas." I take that to heart. I don't scare easily, and I don't back down. But what I experienced that summer shook me to my core. At first, the strange events were subtle. Odd noises here and there, weird movements in the corner of my vision. It was nothing I couldn't brush off as rats or my imagination. I'd been on the job for about 5 years at this point, so I didn't think much of it. But by mid-July, things escalated. One night, I was walking through an old office building. These places are huge, and patrolling them can take up most of the night. I was scanning the area with my flashlight, half zoning out, when I heard a strange grinding noise across the hall. It sounded like someone dragging a chair across the floor, the kind of screech that makes your teeth clench. I walked into the room where the sound was coming from. As I entered, the noise became louder, constant, back and forth. Annoyed, I called out, "Whoever's in here, you need to leave." But as I rounded the corner to the source of the noise, it stopped. A chair sat in the middle of the room, abandoned. I figured whoever was in there must have gone out the other side, so I hurried to cut them off. But as I reached the other door, I heard a loud slam behind me. I spun around and saw the chair had been thrown across the room. It landed just inches from where I'd been standing. Now I was pissed off and confused. I searched the room thoroughly, checking every nook and cranny. There was no one there. The door was heavy and creaky, so I would have heard if someone had left. Still, I brushed it off, wrote my report, and continued my shift. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, though deep down I knew something wasn't right. A couple of weeks later, in early August, I was working some overtime. I heard distinct, heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. I followed the sound to the end of the hall, but just as I got there, the footsteps suddenly started again behind me, on the other end of the hallway. I turned around and followed the sound back. This happened twice more, with the footsteps switching ends of the hallway each time. By now I was convinced someone was messing with me. I called out, "All right, you've had your fun. Get out of here before I call the cops." There was silence for a moment. Then I heard an inhuman scream. It was loud, guttural, and completely unnatural. Chills ran down my spine as I froze in place. Suddenly I heard a barrage of footsteps rushing toward me. The sound was so intense, it felt like the walls were vibrating. Panicking, I turned and ran in the opposite direction. But as I reached the end of the hallway, I heard the scream again this time. It sounded like my name was being called. I stopped, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was just my imagination or some sort of acoustical anomaly. After a few minutes of deep breathing, I worked up the courage to go back and investigate. The hallway was silent and empty. Later that night, as I walked through the building, I noticed the air felt heavier. My head started pounding, and I swore I could hear faint whispers. I turned a corner and saw the light flicker on the wall, as though something had just moved past it. I called out again, "Who's there?" But no one responded. By the time my shift ended, I was shaken but determined not to let it get to me. I wrote another vague report, not wanting to sound crazy. In October, things reached a terrifying peak. It was the 1st or 2nd of the month, and I was in a great mood. I'd recently met someone, and life outside of work was going well. As I walked through the building, humming to myself, I heard that same inhuman scream. This time it was louder than ever. Determined to put an end to this once and for all, I ran toward the sound. But instead of finding an empty hallway, I stumbled upon a trail of blood. My stomach dropped as I called 911. Following the trail, I found a woman lying on the floor, her body covered in gashes. She was barely alive, coughing up blood. I tried to comfort her, but I could hear something else, a low growl, coming from down the hall. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the growling grew louder. It sounded like a wild animal, but something about it was wrong. It was deeper, more guttural, almost demonic. I yelled for help as the paramedics arrived, but the woman passed away before they could do anything. To this day, I don't know what attacked her. The official report claimed it was an animal attack, maybe a rabid dog. But I don't believe that for a second. Whatever was in that building wasn't natural. After some time off, my supervisor reassigned me to a less isolated building. I still work nights, but nothing as terrifying as that has happened since. I'll never go back to that office building, and I hope I never have to. Working as a 911 dispatcher, you'd think you've heard it all until a chilling series of calls starts coming from a mysterious source. What begins as cryptic cries for help spirals into a nightmare so haunting, it will leave you questioning what's real. Stay with me, because this story will keep you guessing until the end. My name is Maddie, though that's not my real name. I used to work as a 911 dispatcher on the night shift for my area. I won't share the location, as I don't feel comfortable doing so. Anyone who works in emergency dispatch can tell you that it's a tough job. It's mentally and emotionally draining, because you're responsible for making sure people get the help they need as quickly as possible. But some of the things you hear on the other end of the line are absolutely horrifying. We go through a lot of training to handle these situations, and there's always support available if we need help dealing with the stress. But nothing in my training could have prepared me for what I experienced over the course of several nights. It started one December evening during the holiday season. One of the first things we ask callers is for their address. This is critical because unless you're calling from a landline, we often don't know your exact location. At the time, our system wasn't advanced enough to pinpoint a cell phone's precise location. That night I answered a call and heard a man's voice say one word, "Help." His voice was groggy, like he'd just woken up, and then the line went dead. Normally, even with a cell phone call, some location data appears on our system. But this time there was nothing, no address, no coordinates, no identifying information at all. I reported the incident to my supervisor. She told me it was probably a technical glitch, but to let her know if it happened again. The rest of my shift was uneventful. But just as I was getting ready to clock out at 6 a.m., I got another call. It was the same groggy voice, saying the same word, "Help." The line went dead again. I immediately informed my supervisor. She told me to go home and get some rest while she looked into it. The next night I asked her if she'd figured anything out. She said she hadn't, but if it happened again, she'd handle the call herself. Around 11 p.m., I got another call. As soon as I saw the blank caller information on my screen, I knew it was him. I signaled my supervisor, who quickly took over the call. This time there was nothing but heavy breathing on the other end. Then the line disconnected. Frustrated, my supervisor had me switch to a different computer system, thinking it might be a glitch in our equipment. But at 2 a.m., the man called again. Once more, there was no location data. My supervisor warned the caller that if this was a prank, they could face legal consequences. There was silence on the line before it went dead again. By this point, we were both confused and annoyed. The rest of the night passed without any issues. The calls stopped for the next couple of weeks, and I started to think the whole ordeal was over. But just after New Year's, the man called again. This time, his voice sounded different. He asked, "Why didn't you help me?" For the first time, caller ID displayed a location the call was coming from inside our own building. My supervisor's face went pale as she grabbed a flashlight and said she was going to search the premises. She told me to stay at my desk and keep doing my job. I had a bad feeling about this. At around 4 a.m., I got another call. The man's voice sounded happy this time, almost gleeful. "She's mine now," he said. The line went dead, and I immediately tried to signal my supervisor. She didn't respond. I hadn't seen her since she'd left to search the building. When my shift ended, the daytime supervisor arrived. I asked him if he'd seen or heard from my night supervisor. He said no, but promised to search the building. A few hours later, he called me. They found her in the basement. She was hanging from a pipe. Her death was ruled a suicide, but I couldn't accept that. There was no way she would have done that to herself. For months after her death, I started receiving calls on my personal cell phone. Every time I answered, I'd hear the same man laughing. Eventually, I quit my job and moved far away. Since then, the calls have stopped. But that man's laugh still echoes in my memory, and I'll never forget the events that unfolded during those terrifying nights. What if your peaceful night shift turned into a chilling game of cat and mouse with an unseen presence? This haunting story of unexplained giggles, footsteps, and eerie happenings will keep you on edge until the very last word. I work as a nighttime security guard, watching over a business that I won't identify because revealing it could cost me my job. The work is simple: monitor cameras, check for anything unusual, and patrol when needed. It's a pretty uneventful job most of the time, but things took a turn about 10 years ago. I'd been working at this place for 5 years without incident when, one Saturday night, something strange happened. It wasn't anything big at first. I was monitoring the cameras when I noticed a door open slightly, then close again. The door wasn't supposed to move on its own. It had a heavy latch that required effort to open and would usually lock itself once it shut. Thinking there might be someone inside, I noted the room number and went to investigate. When I arrived, the door was ajar. I stepped inside, calling out, "Security, is anyone here?" There was no answer. The room was empty, and the door shut firmly behind me. I tested it several times to make sure it wasn't malfunctioning. Everything seemed normal. I filed a report, noting the odd incident, and moved on. At the time, I didn't think too much about it. The following Saturday, things got even stranger. Around 1 a.m., I noticed someone running through the hallways on the cameras. I followed their movements until they were near my security room. Then, the power surged, and everything went dark for a moment. When the power came back, there was a loud pounding on my door. I rushed to check the hallway, but there was no one there. I reviewed the camera footage, but the screen showed nothing. By now, I was beginning to feel uneasy. Still, I wrote another report, trying not to sound too paranoid, and finished my shift. 3 months later, I had another encounter, this one even more unsettling. I was sitting in my security room, going through routine checks, when I heard faint giggling. At first, I thought it was the sound of a video playing on someone's phone or a distant TV, but when I checked the cameras, no one was around. The giggling continued, soft but persistent. Deciding to investigate, I stepped out into the hallway. The sound seemed to be coming from the far end, so I followed it. But as I got closer, the giggling moved further away, as if it was leading me somewhere. Every time I rounded a corner, the sound would shift to another hallway. This went on for nearly an hour, until it finally stopped. When I returned to the security room, I checked the footage. There was no sign of anyone in the building. I didn't file a report this time. I didn't want to sound crazy. Over the years, there have been many similar incidents: footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing on their own, and that eerie giggling. I don't know what's causing these things, but I've grown used to it. In a strange way, I even look forward to the occurrences. They make my shifts less boring. It feels like I'm playing a game of hide and seek with something unseen. I still don't know what it is, but whatever's haunting the building doesn't seem threatening. I just hope it stays that way.